Today we talk about how to blend themes into mechanics. Hello, everybody, and welcome to What is Tabletop? My name's Frank, and unfortunately, Charles has been kidnapped. His job will not let me do anything to get him back. So today we have another special guest. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
My name is Peter. I'm the creator and lead designer of Tales from Elsewhere, a series of indie tabletop role playing games that have an emphasis on action horror and all sorts of things like Weird West and dark fantasy. And I'm just a small creator myself and a fan of this channel.
Well, thanks. We're glad that you're a fan. We're glad that you reached out because while Charles is still being kidnapped, it's going to be hard to come up with these videos by myself. So I appreciate it. All right, so we're going to be talking about themes and mechanics. And so first, we're going to talk about like the differences. In your opinion, Peter, which is better, themes or mechanics?
That is a great question because I think you can't have actual themes in a game without mechanics,
Hmm.
but mechanics can get in the way of theme. And so I think neither is going to be superior to the other. I think they're intimately intertwined. And when a game doesn't overemphasizes one over another, they lose out.
Yeah, I've found that, and we talked about this last episode, right? Theme tends to hook people, but mechanic make them stay. I found that, right, like Fiasco. If I didn't enjoy the fact that it's really just improving and creative storytelling, like with a really cool system around it, I don't know if I would use Fiasco as much as, say, another RPG. But because Fiasco is built around the theme of things are inevitably going to go wrong for all the characters, that's like the hook. But then the mechanics are there to be like, okay, and here's some randomness to introduce yourselves into the story. And now you can start playing off and telling a more unique story than just whatever you might have had in mind in the first place. So I definitely agree with that. Is there any like mechanics that you can think of off the top of your head that like are really good in terms of being thematic while also still having a good mechanical like foundation?
Well, a game that you were actually mentioning in one of your other recent videos that you were playing with your group was Dread.
Hmm.
And Dread has a very simple mechanic involved in its resolution system that
Hmm.
absolutely reinforces its theme. The Jenga tower is a stroke of genius when it comes to theme and mechanics. Like people get it immediately, even if
Hmm.
they've never played a tabletop role playing game.
Yeah, I remember hearing about it and I'm like, that is just so clever. Cause like the nervousness of pulling from a Jenga tower is already there in the game. But then to add the stakes of, and if it falls, your character dies, adds so much more like depth to it. I got to play with Charles and Evan, or another guy of ours, and just like letting it be like, I'm just gonna sit back. What are you gonna do? It's like, no, not that one. No, not that one. It's like, okay, it's gonna fall. Oh no, okay, you survived this time, but we'll see what happens next time. It's such a clever mechanic for sure. Going back to Star Wars because I really enjoy it. I think does a good job. I A lot of people like to talk about the Force die, and I think the Force die does a good job. I actually think the mechanic that I like the most is Destiny points, where it's light side and dark side, and the players use the light side points to get to do cool things. But when you do that, it becomes a dark side point, and so you might have more resources at first, but then the GM's getting more resources, and then now they get to do things, which helps with the ebb and flow of like, oh yeah, of course, dark like evil's winning. They have more points than us. Of course, they're going to be able to do more cool things than we get to do. But then eventually, it balances itself out like in Star Wars. It's all balance, and so it works out really well.
Right? That ebb and flow, wheel and woe, push and pull of the force is really cleverly represented by those dice. And there's drama value to it as
Hmm.
well. As the DM reaches over, starts flipping dice back to light side, oh no, what is he doing?
There's in having players who are like, "Ah, I'm gonna use the last light side point. It's gonna mean that he gets to do whatever he wants this next turn, but I need to do it just to possibly do better on this roll." Is so entertaining to watch from behind the screen. And then I can just be like, okay, cool, cool. I'm gonna now be really mean. He's gonna activate three of his abilities. This villain's gonna one shot you. You're have two critical injuries now. It also makes the villains more like, you know, big and powerful, which I think is really good. And it's just a cool system that I genuinely might have to figure out a way to steal for like other
Right?
games.
It's very clever. But the fact that it's a meta resource that's shared by the whole table
Hmm.
means everybody is involved in the decision making and the leveraging of it. All the players get to talk and say, no, maybe we need to save that one last
Right.
pip to not turn it to the dark side, right? And that just increases engagement even when it's not an individual player's turn. So it's just top to bottom, great design.
I'm going to be interested to see how Daggerheart's similar system of hope and fear works. We play tested it, and it was fun. I know since then they've changed how frequently you get hope, what you can use it for, which is nice. Just making it a more resource dependent system where like each class can kind of use its own thing. But then the GM just stockpiling fear and using it for the right moment's a really cool thing too, and you can just see it coming is going to be really interesting. Is there any other mechanics that you think do a good job, or is there a mechanic that you think does a bad job?
I have an example of it's good and
Mhm.
bad. So older versions of Deadlands, a Weird West role
Mhm.
playing game. I'm a big Western fan. If you were a spellcaster, a huckster, in order to use your magic, you had to play a hand of
Yes.
poker against your inner demon. And
Mhm.
boy, is that cool. Oh, that just oozes theme and flavor and immersion. But you put two hucksters at a table of five players, and the speed at which the game resolves comes to a grinding halt.
Yes.
So it's excellent theme, but at the same time, it impedes the gameplay to a point where I think it is a disservice. It's that
Mhm.
sacrifice that any designer has to consider, right? Is this the amount of amazing flavor worth
Mhm.
the impediment to gameplay?
Yeah, when you have to do a mini game in combat that not every player is going to be participating in, that's not as fun. That's why like spells are really important because you obviously want spells to be able to do important things. But when it becomes a point where it's like, oh, this mini game is now something that this martial character is never going to be able to interact with, that means the martial characters are like, oh, cool. I guess there's no point in me being here. Um,
I guess I'll just watch.
yeah, I'll just watch. Like Star Wars is cool because you're using the Force die, and there's a chance you might not get it. But you can also then use the destiny points again. Really good thematic tie-in of like, okay, we'll use some light side points so that way, even though I rolled dark side, I'm going to be able to do the thing I want to. Maybe just not as good as I want it to. Like that's a good use of like a sub mechanic theme without it being overbearing.
Yeah, and the marshals, soldiers and such in Star Wars
Mhm.
are very effective, very powerful. They do have decisions they can make, that they don't feel as bland in comparison to Force
Right,
users as maybe other more asymmetrical games like Bog's standard champion fighter in 5e Dungeons and Dragons
right,
starts to really feel uninteresting in comparison to a 12th level wizard.
right. It goes back to it too. Let's say you make a character who doesn't have a combat skill in a game. If it's not viable, but it's a combat heavy system, like that kind of sucks for the player who just wanted to be the talker. I know, like they've talked about in many of the videos they put out for the Cosmere RPG for Brandon Sanderson of like we have characters from his books that we want people to be able to still play and be important even when combat's happening. And that's why again, Star Wars, same people, makes sense that they're the ones who ended up doing it cuz I we have a player, he's a diplomat. He doesn't really fight, he just convinces people to stop fighting them. And that's like just as good and he has abilities that it's not like why is this guy talking when bullets are flying? It's like, "Oh no, he's convincing people or he's saying, "Hey, look how deadly we are. Are you sure you want to keep putting up with this?" And one of the henchmen could be like, "Ah, I'm good, I'm out." Like that's a really fun thematic system that still rewards the player for role playing.
Yeah, definitely agreed. And you'll find a lot of these kinds of design spaces in horror games in particular,
Hmm.
as those are ones that really need that theme and use a little bit different systems. Like Mothership is
Hmm.
an interesting example because it oozes theme. Uh, and the monster stat blocks often have almost nothing written in them because the assumption is they're not meant to be interacted with. They just kind of kill you. It's the movie Alien, not the movie Aliens,
Right.
right? You're not the necessarily the group of ragtag soldiers out to kill Xenos. You're just trying to survive a day on the derelict
Hmm.
spaceship. At the same time, the lack of rules around it, though,
Hmm.
means a lot more gets offloaded into the adventure design or into the GM's
Hmm.
sort of. prerogative, which is challenging for some new players, or sorry, some new GMs, I think.
I think that's why you'll find a lot of people going towards 5th edition. It's a very easy yes no system. Things just work out. Most of the time, things are already kind of leveled in the beginning, at least. Later levels is its own ball of wax. But like going back to your thing about, I do agree with you. I think horror RPGs do a really good job. I like 10 candles, where you're rolling dice equal to the amount of candles that are lit, and then every time you fail a roll, you just roll one less die. And so, like the horror of we're not going to succeed nearly as much because our resources are dwindling, just like in horror, where it's like we're not doing well, we're losing bits and pieces, is another like really cool way to do that without it being like, I would say, super thematic, but it is thematic because the tension is
Oh yeah.
still there.
Yeah, I'd be remiss to not mention Shadow Dark in this conversation if we're talking horror design.
Hmm.
Have you played much Shadow Dark or familiar
I'm
with it?
not, no, no, no.
So all the core rules we'll set aside for a moment, except one thing. It's about going deep into a dungeon or into a cave, right? Your torches last a real world amount of time. So the
Mm,
GM sets a timer and you can only bring a few of them. And so there's this tension as like the 1 hour your torch lasts starts ticking down in real life. And that is a really cool and thematic way to push the players to not
hmm.
dilly dally in the dungeon, right? As they only have so much light before they'll basically just die if they don't have any light. Like if you're trapped down in there with no torches, there's no dark vision, nothing that helps you get around it. You're just in big trouble. So that's a very cool one to also say here.
Let's go to like Powered by the Apocalypse games. What I find fascinating about those games is the type of actions you choose are dependent on each RPG. So like for Avatar, it's not attack, move, stuff like that. It's relying on your training. And so it's like, can you conceivably do this because of your past experiences? Cool, you're going to rely on your training. Is it something you're making up on the spot? Well, then you're going to use that move. And I think sometimes that's really good, for sure. Like the different moves that you can come up with. I think masks, piercing the mask, where like that one where it's like you're trying to get to the heart of who someone is. Awesome. Then there's other times where I'm like, why is this move here? Not entirely sure.
Yeah, like what was the designer thinking? Wait, when was I supposed to use this?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. You were talking to me earlier about a specific game and like a move that you wanted to like shed light on. If you wanted to go ahead and talk about that.
Yeah, one Powered by the Apocalypse game is called Cartel, and it is a very violent game, and it's about being in a cartel, it's about
Hmm.
getting in shootouts, but one of the moves in that game is called Get Effing Shot.
Mm.
And it's a quick die resolution that almost invariably ends in somebody just bleeding out on the floor. Because the game wanted to reinforce it. Yes, violence happens a lot in this type of story they're telling, but it's incredibly deadly.
Mm.
And it's meant to tell shorter stories in that way, very dramatic stories where somebody, in the end is bleeding to death and there's not much you can do to save them. They just sort of die.
Kind of like Reservoir Dogs a little bit. Granted,
Yeah.
one of those characters was bleeding out for a considerably long time.
Yeah, they stretched the drama of that
Hmm.
scene for an extended period of time. Yeah, and Powered by the Apocalypse is cool in that way, as anybody who wants to make a game powered by the apocalypse can just directly inject some of their theme into the
Hmm.
game with just a few words. Just name the move something cool,
Yeah.
and you've already moved the player into the right mindset for it, which is why it's such a popular game to hack and mod and
Right.
build your own in.
I think that brings up to like dying mechanics, right? Obviously, not every RPG is about death and dying, but all the cool ones are. And so I find it always fascinating, like, how does that work, right? In 5th edition and in some other like very combat focused games, it's you go to 0 and then you have so many saves you have to make and then you just die. And it's like kind of anticlimactic, where it's like, oh, this player character, this important character just died, but it was like a few rolls and now they're dead. What I like that Daggerheart's doing is when you get to that point, you make a choice. Okay, you can choose to try to come back to life through a die roll. You can choose to come back, but you're going to take a permanent like negative stat, or you can go out with a bang. Like I'm dead, that's fine, but let me do something that is really cool for my character, which I think is like systems like that are always very interesting. It also brings up fascinating things like, are you familiar with? I think it was called Phoenix by Monty Cook Games.
No, I haven't read that one.
I forget. I think it might not be Phoenix. But the idea is you level up when your character dies, which is an because they wanted to take the worst part of role playing, character death, and tie it with the best part of role playing, leveling up. Very cool idea in their game lore. Really awesome. The problem is you have people just throwing themselves off cliffs so that way they can level.
Yeah, that was where my mind immediately went. So I can power level by jumping
Mhm.
off a lot of cliffs then, huh? Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's a cool idea, right? This is when I think theme and mechanics can tie together, and then you just don't think it through enough. And it's like, oh yeah, leveling up when you die is so cool. Oh, oh, they're just always dying.
Yeah, whoops.
Yeah, having a dramatic moment happen when a character dies, full go for it. I think that's awesome. I also like personally, I'm a fan of like doomed characters who are they've made a deal or they're slowly ticking away. And so like if you could come up with a resource system where it's like, in order to do this cool thing, you use this resource. The second you have zero of that resource, you're dead. Right. So it's your own fault that you die. I think that's another like cool idea. But then you have to come up with a world based around that.
A character's death should always be interesting and dramatic,
Hmm.
or don't have rules for it really, right? What a system mechanicizes
Hmm.
is what the game is kind of telling you you should be able to do or what you should do. I mean, there's social games that are some would consider only tenuously in the tabletop role-playing game area, like The Good Society. There's no rules for dying.
Hmm.
It's a like a social interaction game with no dice rolls. You use tokens to exchange. It's like living in a Jane Austen novel,
Yeah.
and it's very cool. And it doesn't have any way to shoot somebody or
Right.
stab somebody because it's just not about that. There's no rules that cover death in that same way, and that tells you what the game's about. While if you have incredibly detailed rules about dying, probably means that they intend to kill you.
Yeah. You can look at how important death is to a game by how hard it is for a PC to die. In the Star Wars game, very difficult. And what's funny is they're taking this system and putting it in the new Cosmere RPG, but I can already tell I'm like, oh, you made it easier to kill people. It's not as difficult as it used to be. Um, but it's still not easy. Like a character going down does not mean they instantly die. And so I think the idea behind that is, you don't want characters at low levels to die, and stuff like that. Let me ask you this question, Peter. What would you say is the hardest part between blending theme into mechanics?
What makes a good mechanic is not necessarily what is thematic, I think
Mm,
is the hardest part. Sometimes something that you're really married to when you're designing a system, something you think is so cool and evocative and really just immerses somebody, you set it down to test, to run it with a group, and you realize this is a nightmare to use. Like it just
mhm.
doesn't work. It doesn't actually play well. And all of these things you thought it was going to do only works because you made the system, right? You're so familiar with
Right.
it. And when you set it down with players and they bounce off it hard, that's challenging to figure out why and then to come back and try not to lose that flavor and iterate on it continually. So that's I think one of the hardest parts about it. It's easy to write cool lore,
Mhm.
to make flashy words, even to get cool art. All of that is fairly easy. But then to find the balance between something thematic and then something that's actually mechanically sound is really hard.
Yeah, I remember talking with Charles because he wants to make his own and he's been like tinkering with it here and there. He had an idea where it was that you can use things against other players. So the system is more focused on like tension between people, not necessarily combat, though combat could be used. And so you're like almost trying to say, "Oh, I can if I do this successfully, I get this benefit and then I can use it against your character." And in like an office setting where it's like everyone's trying to get the promotion, that's actually really cool. It's a really interesting system. He then also had something tied into it where in character creation, everyone can make a secret. And it could be about one of the other players, but there's short-term secrets that get revealed in that session and then long-term secrets. And I was like, what if there was a really cool way to tie those together where if you're able to figure out someone's secret for the short term, you get this benefit from it, right? And so then it becomes a little bit of a different game of trying to figure out what everyone's secret is and keeping it hidden, So like you can see already how just changing small things here and there completely changes the theme of the game, right? Where if it's
Yeah.
political backstabbing versus holding in my secret so no one finds out, it's not necessarily the same thing, but it can be.
Yeah, and player versus player mechanics can be very thematic and are really difficult to implement. So,
Hmm.
for example, when you and Charles are playing, you two can probably drum up all sorts of character conflict between the two of you, and you're just fine with it.
Right.
But sit down with strangers at your local game store with a system that and creates antagonistic relationships, and it can get very challenging. I've had a blast building antagonistic characters with people I play with because I've been playing with them for over a decade. So, I can be this sinister kind of hand-wringing Jafar character to the party's fighter who dreams of being a king. And you
Hmm.
can say, I'm only keeping you around as long as you're useful, and then I'll chop your head off type. We can do that sort of thing.
Right.
And I can try to tempt him to evil, all that kind of stuff. And it works because I already have a rapport.
Hmm.
But having played a lot of games with strangers over the many years I've been playing these games, it would be challenging to do that without some very good structure in place.
Yeah, I come from board gaming, so social deduction games is like my bread and butter. And so I've always had to tell people like there's me, Frank, in the real world. He will never lie to you. Game Frank will lie to you all the time. And then he'll tell you the truth and you'll think it's a lie, and that's when you actually get done with.
We used to say, because I used to play a lot of Settlers of Catan
Mhm.
back when that was brand new in the States. And my group would always say, when everybody started getting mad, we'd just say, "This is Catan," as a way to say, what happens here in this game cannot affect our friendship because
Right.
we were so brutal and cutthroat in it.
Yeah, and that's why like it was interesting to me reading Candela Obscura when in the rules it says there's no player versus player combat. And I think that's fine. I don't think that's a bad thing. I usually think that's more reserved for a per table basis rather than the game to determine, especially when you're doing a live play and like putting it on the internet. And in that, there's player versus player conflict, but you're saying in your own games that's not a thing. It can come across as like, okay, wait, so there
Yeah.
isn't player versus player, but you're allowing it. So why is that rule?
Not all of us are trained improv
Hmm.
actors, comedians, and voice actors, right? Who've been working together for a
Right.
decade. So yeah, it's one thing for them to do it, but then to not have a mechanic for it is interesting.
Hmm.
That's maybe a longer term subject, but if a system isn't providing you just a rules world for you to play with, but
Hmm.
drawing lines in, you cannot attack another player. It's a very different kind of system, right?
Right.
It's telling you a different thing. And I know some players really bounce off that if they don't have a way to resolve conflict, like
Hmm.
the cipher system,
Yes.
which not the most popular system. I actually have a very soft spot in my heart for it. Like, get at me in the comments about this. But I played a superhero. I ran a superhero game using the cipher system. I actually had a lot of fun with it. The game, the core resolution is asymmetrical. The GM never
Right.
rolls.
Right.
And so to have two players do something in conflict with one another
How does that
actually
work?
threw me off. Yeah, I stopped for a moment and I thought, wait, how do I actually resolve this? I need to open up the book. I mean, I can
Hmm.
just adjudicate it on the fly, but there really wasn't much to cover that. So that's
Right.
interesting when a game does that. It's strange. Yeah.
Yeah. I think again, if you bake it into the world and like where the rules are, then it's fine. If you know upfront, hey, by the way, this is a game. You're meant to be a team. You're meant to work together, right? I think that works for like paranormal investigation more than like thieves doing a heist job. Because thieves doing a heist job, we expect at least one of the thieves to backstab everybody else. So if you're telling me in your heist game, I can't backstab somebody, like that makes me like feel like it's a thematic, disparity.
Yeah, like a disconnect there. Yeah. Well, and when you were talking about Charles's rules idea, I immediately went to a heist
Hmm.
place with it, right? That's really cool and could be a really fun way to build a heist focused tabletop role playing game would be
Right.
everybody has a dark secret. Everybody's trying to leverage one another to get a bigger cut at the
Yeah.
end type of thing. Or what was it? The intro to one of the Batman movies was, everybody backstabbing each other in sequence. That could be super fun,
Hmm.
built correctly and with the right sort of rule structure around it. Yeah, that'd be super fun.
I did a one shot that it was Charles's first time playing with us in fifth edition. And I told him, I'm like, what we'll do is we'll do a one shot. If you enjoy it, we'll take that character, play them again. So it was like his character's pseudo backstory before he played the game. And in it, I'm like, I'm gonna have some fun. I'm gonna have it's a heist campaign, so everyone's gonna have some dirt on everyone else, right? And so it was like they were all going after a target. I told Charles, "What is your character's goal?" And he's like, "Oh, I just want to complete the mission." I'm like, "Good." And then I turned to another person. I'm like, "Your job is to you know who the target is. Your job is to murder them." And then your job is to protect your brother who wants to do this terrible thing. And then your job is actually to make sure they stay alive. And again, these were PCs in a one shot that I knew were never going to see the light of day again. So like, I was like, hey guys, as long as you don't go after Charles, have fun. And the amount of backstabbing that was hilarious. At one point, one of the brothers killed the other brother because he was getting in the way, and he's like, "Why? I just wanted to protect you." And he's like, "You're not. I always hated you. You're the older brother. I've always." It was just so fun to be able to do that. Um, and like, I would love to see a game where it's like the intent is to backstab each other, and somehow you get dirt on everybody, and you just see what happens.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that segues naturally into something I wanted to mention about fifth edition. So, depending on who you talk to on the internet, people will either say fifth edition is the greatest gift to role playing ever, or the exact opposite of that.
Mhm.
But I think regardless of that, you were telling a heist story where the memory you have of that session is less about the mechanics itself and more about the narrative you told with your
Yes.
friends. And in the end, all of these systems are just trying to give you a toolbox to do that.
Uh,
And you can tell any story in any system if you're willing to just apply DM elbow grease, right? And I've told horror stories, romance stories, everything in Dungeons and Dragons from I started in third edition over
mhm.
20 years ago. And you can tell any story using any system as long as it gives you enough wiggle room on
Right.
it. But I do find that more focused systems that are attempting to achieve a certain theme or a certain type of gameplay end up pushing that even further, like Dread, like
Mhm.
Shadow Dark, like Masks,
Mhm.
right? Yeah, you can run a supers game in fifth edition if you are willing to do a ton of work. But why when you have Masks, which can tell this lovely story of young superheroes, if you're a fan of like Young Justice, right? And these
Right.
kind of shows, right? And it's able to push that theme farther and more easily than you could with just any system.
And that's ultimately where I land on this entire topic is if the mechanics make it to where it's easy to role play the theme, then it's doing a great job. I mean, obviously, if we look at like Dimension 20, they've had an insane amount of different kinds of campaigns, all in mostly fifth edition. So to your point, it's entirely true. You can almost use any system if you do enough work for any other system. But the mechanics of it are what like if they're really on theme, it's going to make it really interesting. So like for masks, the rule of your characters don't kill is already you know what kind of story you're trying to tell. You're not doing this boys or invincible story where it's like we're actually going to subvert stereotypes which becomes the new stereotype. But anyway, you become like we want to be heroes so we want to do what's good and that means not killing people. I don't think that means you can never kill anyone, but I think the rules are telling you if murder happened by one of your players, it should be a insanely important moment. The other characters should be like, "Why did you do that?" Your character, like the character that killed somebody, needs to have some like emotional like stakes involved of like, "Oh, I pushed myself too far because this mechanic led to here," and naturally the narrative beat was this guy dies.
It's like a season finale moment, right? That's what in an animated superhero show from the early 2000s that all of the people who made Masks watched.
Right. And when masks were like the main arguably the main mechanical point is influence people have over you. When a teenage superhero kills someone, whether intentionally or by accident, and the rest of the team has to grapple with that, there's a lot of interesting dynamics that can be played from there where it's like, I used to trust you. Now I don't know if I can do that anymore. And so now you have characters who are trying to redeem themselves, or maybe they go too far down. But the story is there all because of one rule that says, hey, don't kill anybody.
Yeah, and that structure helps new GMs in particular get into it. So, I play a lot at local game stores and such, and there are people that come in who have been watching Critical Role or
Hmm.
Dimension 20, which are obviously awesome, and they're run by professional
Hmm.
they're basically professional game designers and voice actors and actors, and the production value is immense, and they sit down with, me in my tank top after a long day at work, and maybe I can't do all my funny voices because I've been in meetings all day, and maybe I'm a little tired, right? So a little
Mhm.
structure for the rules is really nice. Because players come in with an expectations these days sometimes that it's going to be easy and you can just run with it. But that structure, when you're new, is so helpful. You don't just throw somebody with a 350-page Dungeon Master's Guide for
Right.
fifth edition and say, "Have at it," right? Make whatever story you want, like Brendan Lee Mulligan does.
Yeah.
No, you need a little structure. You got to start somewhere.
Usually my advice to brand new people is like, "Hey, come up with, like, an interesting story, and then you'll figure it out from there." Like, Charles, his first group he wanted to run was in Fallout because he likes the world. And I'm like, "Great, that means you're gonna come up with an interesting story, first, and then, like, we can always learn the mechanics as we go."
Yeah, it's a rite of passage to base your first game if you're a teenager on like some anime you liked when you
Yes.
were 15, right? This is, or a video game. One of the first characters one of my good friends made in Dungeons and Dragons many years ago, Devil May Cry had just come out.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so he made a red trench coat, white-haired fighter with a great sword named Dante. So, and we lord that over him to this day because it was such blatant plagiarism.
I had a friend in college who wanted to play Bruce Wayne, and I'm like, "Come on, man, like, give it a little bit." He's like, "Fine, Brutus Wayfarer," and I'm like, "That's at least better."
Yeah, when you're a new player, you don't have to write your own
Right.
incredibly thought out world. So games that come with a world like Blades in the Dark
Mhm.
comes with an incredibly detailed world for the player. So if you're going to try to design as a new player a heist campaign, that is a lot of work. Blades in the Dark has
Yeah.
it all figured out for you already, though. So that's where those committed thematic designs can help rather than, like I said, handing the 300 plus page Dungeon Master Guide and say, make a heist campaign.
The last mechanic I wanna just quickly mention, I think Lancer, the way they found a way to make leveling up thematic is fascinating, where after you do a mission, the company you work for decides, "Cool, you have access to better mechs now." I'm like, that just to make a leveling system thematic to me was like, I didn't think it was possible, and so I loved that Lancer came up with that. Do you have, like, one more mechanic you wanna shout out?
Yeah, well, and on Lancer, they also figured out the type of game
Mhm.
that crunchy players who liked 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons would
Yes.
love because people who like mech games, whether video games or otherwise, like to fiddle endlessly with
Oh,
all
yeah.
the little bits and bobs.
Oh, yeah.
And Lancer is absolutely that. So Lancer's awesome. The one more I'll mention is Call of Cthulhu. I just feel like I'd
Yeah.
be remiss
Yeah,
to not
yeah.
mention one of the titans of this sort of design space, the impermanence of your character. The
Mhm.
fact that the odds are you will go insane and die every session
Yeah.
is built into the DNA of that game. And people who've read the works of H.P. Lovecraft know that's often how things end. It doesn't end well.
Yes.
And they just lean into that wholly with the design space. And I think that's a good example. I think, well, a lot of people are probably already familiar with that one.
Right. I mean, and again, my thing, I like that that game, Red, and 10 Candles all tell you up front, your character's gonna die. Let's just see how long it lasts. I think that's also something great. Anyway, thank you, Peter. We appreciate you joining us for that. If is there anything you want to plug before we sign off?
Sure. Well, thank you, of course, Frank, for letting me come on here. I'll just plug my game. I'm working on a game called Tales from Elsewhere. It is, like I said at the start of the video, it is action horror. And the first book in that series is called Clockworld. It is post apocalyptic Weird West for all the dozens of us out there who love cowboys and robots and putting them together. And I do have my own YouTube channel. It is at Tales from Elsewhere Games, and hope you come check it out. I'm just getting started in that regard. And thank you again, Frank and Charles out there
We'll
somewhere in
find
the
you.
states. Yeah, we'll find you. So yeah, looking forward to your guys' next video.
Of course. And of course, thank you to everyone who subscribed. We reached 500 subscribers, which is awesome. Super excited. We'll hope to reach 1,000 before the end of the year. We'll do a Q&A and we'll have a lot of fun. All the links that Peter was talking about for his stuff will be in the description. But till next time, everybody, stay witty.